She was 21 and broke. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small carved juniper draw knife worn warm by 4 generations of women's hands, a single-thumbed page from her Granmama's Decoy book sewn into the lining of her canvas jacket pocket, and 5 single-dollar bills she had earned scrubbing crab pots at a small fish house outside Manteo. And with that $5, she bought a weathered cedar shingle decoy shed standing alone at the back end of a low marsh track on the south point of Currituck Sound, in the small Outer Banks village of Whalebone Point in Currituck County, North Carolina, in a stretch of the Banks marsh country that had not heard the slow scrape of a hand-drawn knife across a block of cedar since the autumn of 1963. The cedar shingle siding had silvered and split along the south face. The salt-warped door had loosened on its hand-forged hinges. But what nobody knew, least of all Eliza Whalebone herself, was that pressed flat and sealed in oilcloth beneath the heart pine floorboards of the shed's back room, packed inside a hand-built cypress chest, was something her grandmama and her grandmama's grandmama had carved and set down there across 128 years that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the shed on a hand-printed card thumbtacked to the bulletin board of the small Currituck County Co-op in Corolla in soft pencil. Decoy shed, quarter-acre, sound frontage, $5 or best offer. See Mr. Burwell Etheridge at the courthouse. She had $7.60 folded in the inside pocket of her canvas jacket, the last of 2 weeks of fish house wages. She walked the half-mile down to the small Currituck County courthouse on a cool Tuesday morning in early October, with the sound grass just beginning to turn deep gold along the marsh edges, and she asked the woman at the front desk for Mr. Burwell Etheridge by name. Mr. Burwell Etheridge was 79 years old and had been the deputy clerk of Currituck County for 53 of those years. He looked up at her when she said her name and went very still. "Whalebone," he said slowly, the brogue full in the word. "From Whalebone Point. You'd be Loma's great-granddaughter then." Eliza nodded once. He folded his hands and walked back into a small storeroom and came back with a heavy brass key on a piece of plain hemp twine. $5, he said. "We have been keeping this key 62 years. Your grandmama left it with my father back in 1963, and she told him plain, 'Hand this to whichever whalebone girl walks back down the marsh track asking after the shed.' She paid him 5 soft paper dollars and signed her name. He walked her to the door and set his old hand for 1 second on her shoulder. 'You go on out there before the wind comes in off the sound, hon,' he said. 'The shed has been waiting on you a long while.' She had grown up with the smell of fresh-shaved cedar and brackish marsh water, with the deep, clean cedar smell of a freshly draw-knifed block of Atlantic white cedar coming off a long pine workbench, with the dry, sharp smell of pine kindling burning low in a small cast-iron decoy shed stove on a cold November morning, with the cool, clean smell of fresh linseed oil being brushed slow into a finished black duck decoy on the long workbench, with the warm, amber smell of beeswax being rubbed slow into the carved juniper handle of a hand-draw knife to keep the wood from cracking in the wet, and with the deep, cool dusk smell of the sound marsh itself, breathing slow across the Spartina grass on a warm August evening, brackish and old and full of years. She'd grown up sitting on a low cedar stool inside her grandmama's small decoy shed when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her grandmama's long brown-spotted hands work a small draw knife slow across a single block of Atlantic white cedar on the long workbench, peeling the soft pale wood into the careful curved shoulder of a working black duck, with a slow patience that did not look like work, but like listening. Her grandmama was Loma Whalebone, born in 1940 in the same small frame house at the foot of Whalebone Point Lane, where Eliza would later be born, the only daughter of Marcus and Della Whalebone. She had learned the decoy and the draw knife at the side of her own mother on the same long heart pine workbench and the same carved juniper draw knife her great-grandmother had brought up from Knott's Island in 1897. Loma was tall and thin, with the long brown-spotted hands of an Outer Banks marshwoman, her white hair worn in a single tight braid pinned at the back of her neck under a faded blue cotton headscarf. Eliza had called her Granmama from the first day she could shape the sound. Eliza's mother, Iris, had gone to Norfolk when Eliza was 3 and had not come back, and Eliza's father, Caleb, had been lost overboard in a January squall off the South Point when she was 9. So the years had belonged to Granmama from the time Eliza could carry a finished decoy basket without spilling. She learned to tell a Knots Island black duck pattern from a Currituck redhead pattern by the rim of the shoulder before she could read. By 8, she could draw a small draw knife across a block of Atlantic white cedar in a single slow even stroke without splitting a single grain. By 12, she could read a block. She could stand at her grandmama's elbow at the long heart pine workbench in the back room of the shed and see, before her grandmama told her, whether a block of white cedar would draw clean for a sleeping black duck or whether the grain had tightened on the south side of the tree and the block would have to be set aside for a brant decoy instead, whether the brant patterns coming off the workbench were running true to the whalebone line Currituck sound carving, or whether the shoulder line was drifting toward a Knots Island shape, whether the small living waterfowl breath of the marsh outside was carrying the next migration true or thin. By 18, she had drawn her own blocks for 4 full hunting seasons, carved her own finished decoys by hand for 4 full winters, sealed 43 small carved juniper and cedar pattern decoys under the heart pine floorboards in her own hand, and learned every one of the 17 Currituck line decoy signs Granmama said a whalebone woman had to know before she was allowed to seal a pattern decoy of her own under her own initials. Granmama, on a warm Saturday morning in October in Eliza's 18th year, walked out of the small decoy shed with a single freshly carved black duck decoy wrapped in clean linen and laid it in Eliza's hands at the shed step and said, "You are a whalebone woman now, child. The marsh knows you, the draw knife knows you, the shed knows you." And then she said in her quiet way, "And there is one thing your grandmama has not yet shown you, because the shed herself had to choose the morning. Come down to the floor with me." But before Eliza or Loma, there had been Cordelia. Cordelia Whalebone had come up from Knots Island in a small flat-bottomed sound skiff in the spring of 1896, 21 years old, with her young husband Reuben Whalebone, a small cedar trunk holding everything they owned, and a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle holding the carved juniper draw knife her grandmother had handed her at the Knots Island landing, a small leather pouch of saved Atlantic white cedar blockstock from her own father's small Currituck cypress lot, and the rough plans for an Outer Banks waterfowl decoy shed her grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper. The Whalebones had walked north along the marsh track of the south point of Currituck Sound in the summer of that same year, and they had stopped at a low cedar in Spartina Hollow at the back end of the marsh track because the sound water ran shallow and clean the way the Knots Island sound water had run, and a small clear branch came down off the low ridge the way the small creeks had come down off the Currituck cypress lot, and Cordelia had stood at the edge of the hollow on a warm August afternoon, and she had said to Reuben, in the slow, careful Banks brogue she had learned at her grandmother's elbow, "This is the place. The shed belongs here. We will not go further." She had been 21. She had no money to speak of, and no flock yet broken, and no one on Currituck Sound who believed a young Knots Island marshwoman could draw a working flock of Atlantic flyway decoys out of an Atlantic white cedar block with her own 2 hands. But Cordelia had set her hand on a piece of squared heart pine, and she had begun. She and Reuben built the shed through the autumn of 1896, hand-shaping the heart pine sill plates, fitting the cedar shingle siding by hand with hand-cut copper roofing nails, fitting a low cypress lean-to-roof against the south wall, building a long heart pine workbench down the back room wall, and hanging a small juniper plank door on hand-forged iron strap hinges at the south face. Cordelia drew her first black duck decoy from an Atlantic white cedar block on the long workbench in October of 1896. She carved the marsh for 54 winters. She trained her granddaughter Della at her side, and Della trained her daughter Loma, and the shed at Whalebone Point held its draw knives and its workbench and its women without a single empty winter for 67 years, through Cordelia and Della and Loma, until the autumn of 1963 when Loma was 23, and her own mother Della had just gone, and Loma closed the juniper door of the shed, on a cool October evening and walked back down to the small frame house in Whalebone Point and did not open the shed again for 62 years. Granmama had 3 rules for the marsh. The first was this: the wood is the teacher. You do not carve the decoy, child, the Atlantic white cedar that grew slow on the high sand ridge in the cool sound wind, and the long curve of the wood grain along the southwest side of the tree carve the decoy. And you only stand at the workbench with the draw knife in your hands, and you read what the wood is telling you, and you do what it is asking. A decoy carver who thinks she decides the shape of a bird is a decoy carver who will break the shoulder by the 3rd draw because the cedar will turn against her on the bench. The second was this: the shed is the keeper. The cedar shingle siding and the long heart pine workbench and the small cast iron decoy shed stove and the backroom storage pit under the heart pine floorboards and the small south-facing juniper door and the cypress lean-to roof of a working Outer Banks decoy shed are not a workshop. They are a sleeping place and a sorting place and a saving place for the Atlantic Flyway, all in one 20-foot shingle building. A decoy carver who thinks she works the wood in a kitchen is a decoy carver who is fooling herself. The shed is the keeper. The third was this: the pattern is the family. The small carved juniper and cedar pattern decoys your great-great-grandmother carved from her own first Atlantic white cedar blocks in 1896 have been kept in oilcloth bundles in a hand-built cypress chest beneath the heart pine floorboards of the back room for 128 years, never once gone soft, never once gone foul, never once allowed to crack in a careless summer. We oil the carved patterns with fresh raw linseed 3 times a year. We seal each pattern in clean oilcloth and tie it with linen string. We never lift the patterns from the cool cypress dark of the chest unless the next whalebone woman is at the workbench learning the cut. And when a whalebone woman is gone, the next whalebone woman lifts the floorboards the same October morning, oils the patterns in the same stoneware crock, and reseals them in her own hand. Mind the patterns above the other 2, daughter. The block can be cut again, the draw knife can be sharpened, the shed can be reshingled. The pattern, carved once and signed once in the keel, is the family kept in oilcloth and cedar and the slow Currituck dark. Granmama died in November of 2023, on a cool, clear afternoon, in her chair beside the small wood stove in the small frame house at the foot of Whalebone Point Lane, with the open-thumbed decoy book in her lap and a single unfinished, freshly carved black duck decoy on the side table beside her, the keel only half signed. The doctor said it was her heart. Eliza was 20. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the fish house and found Granmama in the chair, and she sat down on the floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Granmama's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She finished signing the half-carved keel of the unfinished decoy herself that night in her own careful young hand, the small carved juniper draw knife moving slow and even across the soft white cedar. And only when the keel was signed did she sit down beside the cold wood stove and finally let herself cry. The small frame house at the foot of Whalebone Point Lane belonged to the county because Granmama had taken a small reverse mortgage on it during her last sickness, and within 5 months of Granmama's funeral, the county had come and asked Eliza to be out by the 1st of October. She had left with the small carved juniper draw knife Granmama had pressed into her hand on her last clear afternoon. The single-thumbed page torn carefully from Granmama's decoy book, sewn into the lining of her canvas jacket pocket, a small canvas bag of her clothes, and the photograph of 3 women standing at the juniper door of the shed in 1948. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small carved thing in your family that someone shaped slow and saved for years on end? A knife handle, a duck decoy, a small bird that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here. The half-mile walk down the low marsh track from the foot of Whalebone Point Lane to the south point of Currituck Sound was longer than she remembered, because the wide marsh opened slow and gold around her as she walked, and the late afternoon light came down soft and silver across the open sound water. The spartina grass was deep gold along the marsh edges, A pair of black ducks rose from the shallows of the sound and beat south on slow, steady wings. A small, clear branch came down off the low ridge, clean and brackish, over rounded fieldstones along the right of the track. She found the foundation of the small frame workshed first, 3 courses of fieldstone in a square of new Spartina, and beyond the foundation, set against the low cedar and Spartina hollow at the back end of the marsh track, under the open arc of an outer bank sky, the small Decoy shed. 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall at the peak of its low cypress lean-to roof, the cedar shingle siding silvered and split along the south face by 62 summers of sound wind, the cypress lean-to roof sagging slightly on its hand-hewn juniper rafters, a small south-facing juniper plank door warped on hand-forged iron strap hinges, rusted dark, a small rust-dark cast-iron stovepipe rising through the south wall, gone cold. 62 autumns of dry marsh dust and dried juniper needles banked deep against the wooden step at the door, the wide silver-gray shallow water of Currituck Sound stretching east behind the shed to the open horizon. She did not cry. She brushed the dust from the cedar step with her boot, fitted the heavy brass key into the small hand-forged brass lockplate set into the juniper doorframe at hip height, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the juniper plank door eased open on its iron hinges with the slow groan of a door that is held shut for 62 winters. The cool, dry breath of the shed came out to meet her, the dim, warm cedar and linseed smell of oiled juniper and old beeswax, and the faint, sharp ghost of 128 years of fresh-drawn Atlantic white cedar. She stood at the door a long minute. Then she lit her grandmama's small brass kerosene lantern, and she stepped into the shed. The shed was 20 feet of slow, dim cedar-warm air, the cedar shingle walls cool and pale silver inside, the low cypress lean-to roof above her dark and warm-smelling of juniper, the heart pine plank floor worn smooth by 67 years of bare and booted feet. A small cast-iron Decoy shed stove against the south wall with a small bundle of dry pine kindling still laid in its firebox. A long heart pine workbench running down the backroom wall, a small draw knife rack hung above the bench with 3 hand-forged draw knives still in the rack gone dark with age. 3 half-finished black duck decoys still on the workbench where Della had set them down in 1963. A small cypress shelf above the bench holding a pair of small finished brant decoys side by side in patient repose. And in the dim warm air of the shed, low at first and then growing in her ears as her ear settled, was the soft, cool cedar and linseed sweet smell of 3 generations of carved Atlantic flyway patterns sealed beneath her feet. She knelt slowly on the worn heart pine floor in front of the long workbench. She remembered, very clearly, a thing Grandmama had said one summer afternoon, over coffee at the kitchen table in Whalebone Point when Eliza was 16. "The good whalebone sheds, child. We keep what is dearest pressed in oilcloth and packed in a hand-built cypress chest beneath the second heart pine floorboard from the workbench in the cool sand dark of the backroom storage pit, because cypress holds cedar against damp and salt better than any cellar in any farmhouse, and no thief who has never drawn a knife across an Atlantic white cedar block on a South Point workbench would think to lift the heart pine floorboards of a Decoy shed and look for what a whalebone woman has set down there." Eliza lifted the second heart pine floorboard from the workbench, the one Grandmama had loosened on her own hand a long time before. Beneath the floorboard, set into a shallow hollow of dry Currituck sand in the backroom storage pit, sealed in a long dark oilcloth bundle tied with weathered hemp twine, lay the cypress chest. She lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than she had expected. She set the chest on the long heart pine workbench and untied the hemp twine of the oilcloth, slow with her fingers, and she opened the oilcloth fold by fold, and inside, the hand-built cypress chest, the lid carved on its top with 3 small joined letter W's. She lifted the lid. And inside, packed in a thin bed of dry Currituck sand and dry juniper shavings, lay the patterns, 43 of them. Small hand-carved Atlantic white cedar pattern decoys, sealed each in clean oilcloth tied with linen string, each carving signed in the keel with small hand-cut initials, and the year, each wrapped slip, a small slip of waxed paper tied to it with linen string, carrying the year and the bird and the woman's full name. Cordelia, Knott's Island Black Duck, 1896, first pattern. Cordelia, Currituck Redhead, 1899. Cordelia, Atlantic Brant, 1904. Cordelia, Sleeping Black Duck, 1912. Della, South Point Pintail, 1928, first pattern under her own initials. Della, Currituck Sound Canvasback, 1934. Della, Whalebone Widgeon, 1942. Loma, Sleeping Brant, 1958, first pattern under her own initials, signed at 18. Loma, Whalebone Point. Black Duck, 1963, the last pattern Granmama had signed in the shed before she had closed the juniper door for 62 winters. The slow Currituck line carving of 3 generations of women, sealed in oilcloth and sand beneath the heart pine floorboards of an Outer Banks decoy shed for 6 decades. Beneath the patterns, in the cool cypress dark of the chest, lay a small flat tin box with a hinged lid and a small leather pouch. Eliza lifted the tin. Inside was the original decoy book, thick, sewn together with linen thread, the cover of soft tanned oilcloth, the pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 3 generations of whalebone women, was the whole record of the shed. The block, the grain, the draw knife pass, the shoulder line, the bird species, the linseed oil date, the waterfowl migration sighting, the signed keel. Page after page after page, 128 years of careful Currituck line Outer Banks decoy carving. Inside the small leather pouch lay 17 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1870s and 80s, the gold Cordelia had carried up from Knott's Island in the lining of her coat. And folded into the back of the decoy book, sealed with a drop of warm, dark beeswax gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful old Outer Banks brogue penmanship, to the granddaughter who lifts the floorboard. From Cordelia Whalebone, Marsh Carver, Whalebone Point, 1897. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and read the letter aloud to the shed, because there was no one else to read it to, and the slow, dim patterns were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who lifts the floorboard. If you are reading this, you have walked down the marsh track with a key in your hand, and you have brushed the dust from the step, and you have turned the bolt, and you have lit a lantern in the dim, and you have known to kneel at the workbench and lift the second heart pine floorboard, and you are a whalebone woman, and the shed has called you home. My name is Cordelia Whalebone. I was born Cordelia Beasley on Knott's Island at the north end of Currituck Sound. In the autumn of 1875, the eldest of 4 daughters of a sound waterman and a marsh carver, and the only one my grandmother taught the draw knife and the cedar block and the saved pattern, because I was the only one who would sit still long enough to learn to listen to the wood. I came up from Knott's Island with my husband, Reuben, in the spring of 1896 with a small oilcloth bundle of the draw knife and the cedar block and the rough plans my grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper, and I walked north along the marsh track of the south point of Currituck Sound, and I stood at the edge of this low cedar and spartina hollow on a warm August afternoon, and I knew, the way a woman knows a thing once and keeps it for 50 years, that the shed was here. I built this shed with my own 2 hands and Reuben's across the autumn of 1896, and I drew my first black duck from an Atlantic white cedar block on the long heart pine workbench in October, and I sealed my first pattern under the heart pine floorboards in November. The patterns in the cypress chest below this letter, daughter, are not money. They are not gold. They are the family. The block can be cut again from the high sand ridge in any quiet spring. The draw knife can be sharpened on the same whetstone. The cedar shingles can be relaid. The patterns, drawn once by a single whalebone hand and signed once in the keel, are the family kept in oilcloth and cedar. The gold in the pouch is the small gold I carried up from Knott's Island in the lining of my coat, and I trust you will not spend it for any reason other than to mend this juniper door or replace this cypress lean-to or buy fresh raw linseed oil from a Corolla store. In a year your own pressing runs cold. Do not move the patterns. Do not unseal an oilcloth bundle unless you mean to set a pattern at the workbench for a young hand to learn from. Do not be greedy with the patterns in the chest. Lift one pattern to the museum curator who comes asking after pre-declined Currituck Sound waterfowl bloodlines, and lay the rest of the patterns in the cypress chest the way you found them, and close the juniper door at sundown, the way a whalebone woman has closed the door of this shed at sundown for 67 years. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Cordelia Whalebone, Marsh Carver, Whalebone Point, Currituck County, North Carolina, the 14th of October, 1897. Eliza laid the letter flat on the long heart pine workbench. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool cedar and linseed smell of the shed and the faint, warm, sweet ghost of 128 years of carved Atlantic flyway patterns, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cold November afternoon she had walked into Granmama's kitchen, loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Edenton the following week, a man named Mr. Lemuel Sawyer, who valued the 17 small $5 gold pieces at $38,600. She sold 5 of them. She put $11,000 in a savings account at the Currituck County Bank, and she walked back down the marsh track with a fresh bundle of cedar shingles for the south face, 2 coils of new hemp twine, a small bottle of fresh raw linseed oil from a Manteo store, a small jar of fresh beeswax, and a small can of new kerosene for Granmama's lantern. She did not move the patterns. The patterns stayed where Cordelia and Della and Loma had sealed them, in the cool cypress dark of the chest beneath the heart pine floorboards. But she did, that first November, walk down off the cedar step with a single hand-carved Atlantic white cedar black duck decoy wrapped in clean linen to the older women of Whalebone Point and Knott's Island. Mrs. Della Beasley, 86, who had been a girl when Cordelia signed her last pattern. Mrs. Loma Etheridge, 82, whose grandmother had been Cordelia's first decoy customer. Each one took the small decoy in their old hands and looked at it for a long time. Each one said the same thing in some form. We had begun to wonder if any of you would come back. And in the early spring, an older woman drove down the marsh track from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology Outer Banks Waterfowl Heritage Project, who had been searching for 30 years for surviving pattern carvings of pre-declined Currituck Sound, black duck and brant lines, and she stood in the open juniper door of the shed on a warm March afternoon with her hand against her mouth, looking at the rows of small carved pattern decoys under the lantern amber, and she said only, "Please, hon, please let me come back with the curator." That is the thing about the marsh keeping our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind, the kind we learn at a long heart pine workbench with a carved juniper draw knife when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the duck. The duck is the wage. The pattern is the trade. The trade is the small hand-carved pattern decoys sealed in oilcloth and sand beneath the heart pine floorboards of an Outer Banks decoy shed for 128 years, and the slow scrape of a hand-draw knife across an Atlantic white cedar block at first light in a cool October dawn, and the cypress chest hand-built and set into the sand under the backroom floor by a young Knott's Island marshwoman who drew the South Point flock out of cedar with her own 2 hands. The trade is, above all, the truth Cordelia wrote in her letter on the 14th of October, 1897. The pattern is the family. The shed is the keeper. The wood is the teacher. We are only the next pair of hands. Eliza Whalebone was 21 years old and broke. She had $5 to her name, and she spent them on a weathered cedar shingle decoy shed, standing alone at the back end of a low marsh track on the south point of Currituck Sound, in Whalebone Point in Currituck County, North Carolina. It was the best $5 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.